Great peace, great peace, great peace. How are you all doing? I'm glad that we are in the middle of the week, and we're headed into the weekend. Not a big fan of weekend moments. I'm not a fan of Friday. I'm not a fan of Saturday and Sunday, especially Sunday. I'm not a fan of it. I'm more of a fan of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Even Thursday, because that's like one of the last business days. So you want to get as much done during the business week, the weekdays. You want to get as much done, as opposed to the weekend. Nothing's really open on the weekend. So in this conversation, I want to talk about double standard and a role that it plays in raising a society, So when I was a kid, right, when I was younger, and, I saw how all my friends would, have things afforded to them, you know what I mean? And how they could easily sense emergency and get out of situations that were considered violent. Because I was always the one, right, who people would be like, don't do this or don't do that, because this can happen to you. And I was always the person who was given that bit of news, to not do something. And I always noticed, like, all my friends, they always had, mothers and fathers and, aunties and uncles who confided in them in a way that you wouldn't do a young person, like you wouldn't talk to a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old as if this person is your equal, right? You're parting knowledge on them so they could, live. But this double standard thing, right? I've never been a fan of people who use double standards. You know what I mean? Like, I've never been a fan of it. Like, I notice, like, the kids now who are being raised in this generation, a lot of them, I haven't heard of it. I haven't heard of it. And sure, abuse happens, right? Abuse happens. But I noticed that, like, the people who I was raised with, they didn't necessarily get, beatings with, stenching cords or beatings with belts. Some of us did, But this young generation right now, a lot of them, they aren't experiencing, what the kids went through in the 90s. Like, if I did something wrong in the 90s or something like that, when I was coming up, I got scarred. You know what I mean? And then you had this lighter skinned children, right, who didn't get whoopings because if you left a mark on them, it would just been obvious. But this is like the complete sense of what we're seeing right now. The kids in Africa, they're coming to America. They aren't necessarily feeling in debt to the culture that's already existing here. The parents who are bringing their children over, they're not beating their children. Like, they're not coming at their children as expecting that, think about it, right? Excuse me. Like, how is it that you come from another country, another world, another village, like another place, a place where this culture is not existing, right? And you come here and you tell your child, like, I brought you here to America so you can experience the great things that this country has to offer. You ask a person like from America, like, why would you bring your child, or would you bring them to a country like Kenya? Would you bring them to a country like Uganda? And a lot of them wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? Like, you see the African mothers and the African fathers, they rush their children over here so they can get a collegiate education, so they can get a universal education. They rush them over here to do those things. And you have to applaud them for doing it. American parents, they don't want to raise their children in a place that's unfamiliar to them. Like, you look at the average African American who's in America, right? You bring them to a place like Nairobi, right? They will feel distant to being from there, but they would necessarily feel distant to being where they're from in America as well. because of the culture shock that both places offer. Like African Americans have this thing where they have to discipline their kids. Well, at least it was in the 90s. They discipline their kids with brute force, with objective brute force. They have to do it. I don't really see that with African parents. They're not knocking their child over this upside the head for doing something wrong. Like I look at how, the guy Chibu, like how he interacts with his family. It's completely different than you say someone who's in America, right, who interacts with their parents. You really don't see, like you saw Chris and Pops, right? But even then, it wasn't like a traditional relationship between, and mother and father. It was his father and, a father and son. But you can see, like, our parents, they even went through a stage where they got disciplined with, switches and belts and stuff like that. And this type of, raising a child, it destroys the fabric of, you walking across the stage being proud of, your son graduating from college or your son graduating from school. It doesn't happen in these scenarios. A child that gets beat, he ultimately ends up doing what? Having backlash towards being beat as a child. He doesn't, call his mom like, Mom, I just graduated. It doesn't happen. So like this thing where you have African parents where they feel like, they could discipline their child once they get here. They could do this, and they're becoming cultured to the sense of being from America. My advice to them, because this is what this video is about, like, be very careful about assimilating into America culture, because, what happened in the early 1900s, it's a remnant fact of what we see today, blacks and whites not coexisting. And it happens in every facet of the notion. It happens. So like, don't beat your child, and, don't curse at your child. Don't have animosity towards the success that your child's achieve. Even into their adult stages, don't do it. Great peace, Yakoki.